Okay, good morning. My name is Doug Smith, and I manage the flow interactions and control portfolio. It's come to my attention that flow interactions and flow control probably has more than one meaning to many different people, particularly people who are doing network flow theory. But what we're going to be talking about right now for flow interactions and control is really about aerodynamics, so fluid flows. Okay, so what we see here is a brief description of the portfolio, and what we're really looking to invest in is this foundational research that examines aerodynamic interactions. A wide variety of aerodynamic interactions. They can involve laminar, transitional, or turbulent flow fields, and they can involve rigid or flexible bodies. So you can think about a flexible wing, for example. It might be moving because we seek to actually actuate it to cause it to move, or it might be moving because of aerodynamic loading. And what we're trying to do is really develop an understanding of the flow physics that's underlying these aerodynamic interactions so that we can develop robust and intelligent control approaches for how to manage those things. We have 4 sub-areas for the portfolio. They're listed here: flow physics for control, novel approaches in flow control, unsteady aeromechanics, and then novel flight mechanics. I'm going to touch on 3 of these sub-areas. And although the portfolio breaks out into sort of 3 different sub-areas, there really isn't a clear demarcation between these different areas. The flow physics for control is really trying to understand fundamentally what's happening in a particular aerodynamic interaction, and that intends to inform sort of novel approaches for how we do flow control. But in order to do flow control, we have to develop modeling techniques, and that modeling technique can feed insight back into understanding how the flow works. I'm going to touch on 3 of these. The first 2, flow physics for control and novel approaches, and unsteady aeromechanic interactions. And then I'm going to wrap up with some novel flight mechanics. And that's the one area that probably is a little bit more disconnected from the rest of the portfolio. And you'll see why that is the case when I get there. Okay, so I'm going to sort of get into the highlights straight away here. I'm sorry I don't have a revised version of my Metro map for this year. I've been told I should have done that, but in any event, my PIs seem to like it. So I'm going to get in, and I'll give you a little bit of sort of background at the beginning of each one of these areas as to why what we're doing. Okay, so the first one's flow physics for control. And so this is really about enabling new approaches to doing flow control. And you can see the banner in the back there, drag reduction. So this is one of the things that we've been interested in for many, many years, is how to do drag reduction. But I think if I look back on the last 20 years of what's been happening in my area, I think there's been a lot of, what can we do to effectively control flow? In other words, I have an actuation scheme, or I have some sort of model, and I plug it in and I see, oh, what happens? And then I try to explain what happens. And I say, well, is that good or is that bad? Is it better than we had before? And where can I go with that? Well, I've tried to change the focus a little bit more and dial it back to being much more fundamental and ask, what should we be doing to effectively control the flow field? What are the important dynamics that are going on? And can we isolate those important dynamical features? And so what I'm going to start with here are just 2 grants that are looking at wall-bounded turbulent flows. So these are the flow fields that are responsible for the viscous aerodynamic drag. And I'm going to show in the first slide sort of how we're beginning to understand the dynamics of near wall turbulence, and then what are the implications for understanding sort of energy transfer within the wall, so that if we can understand how energy is moving between different parts of a turbulent flow, maybe we can short circuit that in some way to gain control. So to start here, I'm going to show a couple of pictures. The first one is in the red here is a direct numerical simulation of a wall-bounded turbulent flow. It just looks like, it's nicely colored red, so you could say it looks like a plate full of spaghetti. And what you're really seeing there are just all of these different sort of what I'll call noodles, but these are vortices. All right. Below that you see what would amount to being a streamwise slice through this. So the flow is from the lower left to the upper right in the top picture. And you can imagine we just came in and we sort of sliced through it and said, what does it look like? So this is an experimental realization, and this is just smoke. The near wall flow has been seeded with smoke and been illuminated with a laser sheet. And you can kind of see features that sort of overlap between these 2 things. You're seeing what looks like circular motions that are kind of swirling things, and this represents, or this sort of captures what's happening in that very complicated sort of direct numerical simulation. Well, it's kind of difficult to sort of sort out what's dynamically important just by looking at these images. So let's downsample these things just a little bit here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to reduce the number of vortices or noodles that we're seeing here. So we're seeing the red and the purple here. And we're also just going to illuminate a particular layer within the flow field, which is the green plane. So we're basically saying here's what a surface at a particular velocity that we've chosen would look like in this wall-bounded flow. So what is Mike Graham then doing here? So why am I showing you these things? Well, what Mike Graham at the University of Wisconsin has been doing is he's trying to understand why if I add a polymer to a liquid flow, why do I get a drag reduction? And what he's discovered is that a turbulent flow tends to alternate. I say alternate, it's not equally alternate back and forth, but it tends to move between what's called a hibernating turbulent state and what he calls an active turbulent state. And as you can imagine, in the active state, there's high drag, and there's a lot of very vigorous turbulence. And in the hibernating state, things are a little bit quieter and there's lower drag. So he's been doing simulations trying to identify these active and hibernating turbulent states. And if we go through and we say, all right, well, let's do what's called a conditional sample. Let's take a velocity profile, just move straight away from the wall when the flow is in this hibernating state. And when it's in an active state, we get these two different velocity profiles. So I'll move over here to the right to show you what those look like. So if the flow is hibernating, I get something that looks like this. And if it's active, I get something that looks like that. So remember, this is for a liquid flow that has a polymer additive to it, which means it has a non-Newtonian viscosity. So what does that mean? Well, air has a Newtonian viscosity, has a linear variation. So how is understanding what's happening in a non-Newtonian fluid going to illuminate what we're interested in the Air Force, which is, the flow of air over an object? Well, it turns out that these active and hibernating states occur just as equally in non-Newtonian fluids as they do in Newtonian fluids, which is to say that what we've learned here from this non-Newtonian flow is informing what we know about turbulence even in Newtonian cases. And that's going to be really important because that's telling us something about the dynamics of the turbulence. It's telling us something about what we're going to call the robustness, which is a theme I'm going to touch on in a little bit. Okay, so let's just kind of move on here quickly. So what has Mike been up to recently? Well, in the last year, he's been doing a lot of direct numerical simulations trying to identify these hibernating and active states in a turbulent flow field. And what we're looking at here in this left picture here is just the average velocity in a wall-bounded flow as a function of Reynolds number. So this is just like different free stream velocities for the Reynolds number. And if you have an active state, and then you tend to follow this lower part of this branch here, this mustard color, which is what you'd expect. If there's a lot of turbulence, you'd get a lot of drag and a lower average velocity in the fluid. And if you have a hibernating state, you kind of go to the upper state. So you can see how these things map over to these other velocity profiles. And he's also been able to identify sort of characteristic vortical structures that exist in these flows, which is to say that when the turbulence moves into an active state, it tends to have a form at these Reynolds numbers that looks like this right here, and when it's in a hibernating state, it tends to look like this, which is the low drag state. Well, so we're gaining insight not just into how the flow switches back and forth between these things, but we're also getting insight into the dynamics of what's happening. Right? Every time it goes to this active state, you see structures that look like this. When it's in a hibernating, it looks like this. And so that's very useful for us. Now, getting back to this idea of robustness, so I have a Newtonian fluid, and it behaves in a certain way. Non-Newtonian, it behaves in, or I should say the non-Newtonian, we've learned something, and it turns out that the Newtonian does exactly the same thing. It's just that the polymer tends to make the flow spend more time in the low drag state than it does in the high drag state. So the fact that we see these coherent structures in these fluids that have very different viscosity profiles is a statement about the robustness of turbulence in these flows. And if there's anything about turbulence, it's the fact that it is a very robust phenomenon. We see very common features in a wide variety of turbulent flows. So I can look at different flows and I can see large-scale motions and things like that. And that's going to be, we would think, important to describing what's happening in a particular flow. So what we have is a group that's led by Beverly McKeon at Caltech, and she's really looking at wall turbulence and saying, okay, how can we characterize the robustness of turbulence? She's interested in energy pathways, how energy is transferred in wall turbulence, but she's starting by looking at understanding sort of the robustness of features. How consistent do we see these sort of turbulent phenomena going on? So, but we don't want just some sort of qualitative analysis. We want something quantitative. So what she's doing is she's going back and saying, well, let's take a look at the original equations of motion that describe what's happening in a fluid flow. And those are the Navier-Stokes equations. And what I've done here is I've highlighted with a red circle sort of the problem term in these equations, and that is this nonlinear convective term. And for 100 years, we have agonized in fluid dynamics over this term alone. How do we understand? We know it's responsible for we know because it's the nonlinear term, we know it's responsible for important convective elements in turbulence, but we haven't, despite many years of effort, been able to come up with perhaps sort of the final way or a good way to sort of describe what's happening from this as it rises from this term. So what Beverly has done in collaboration with one of her colleagues that she worked on a postdoc with over in the UK was to say, all right, well, let's do something maybe a little bit very simple, almost too simplistic. Let's move everything that's not the nonlinear term over to the left-hand side of the equality, call it the linear system because it's all linear, and we're going to move the nonlinear term over to the right-hand side and say, well, that's just a forcing term, and we're not going to ignore it, but we're not going to deal with it and address it. What we're going to do instead is we're going to focus on the dynamics of just the linear term, for which there is a large body of knowledge, both in applied mathematics and in dynamical systems. Okay, so what they've done then is they said, all right, we're going to have a linear system, and we're just going to say it's going to be forced by this nonlinear term. Okay. And so what they've done is they said, all right, well, so here's kind of what the linear dynamics is going on. So we figure out what's happening linear, then we sort of compute what the forcing is and feed it back through to the term. All right, so this is, I've worked with Beverly trying to get a better shot of what she's trying to do, but she always comes back to this. So what she's done is she's taken that linear system and she's decomposing it and basically saying, you know, there's a whole range of different types of modes. And when I say modes, just remember those sort of colorful pictures that Mike Graham was showing of these sort of tubes and different wavy features. That's what we're talking about when we say modes. Just there's a whole lot of these modes that are interacting in these particular flow fields, which she calls the resolvent modes. They are the linear system, which we can kind of understand. And then we're going to have an output from that linear system. We're going to compute the nonlinearity. We're going to feed it back in, and we're going to just see how it responds. Well, it turns out that the response of turbulence is really dominated not so much by this nonlinear forcing, but by the dynamics of this linear system. And I think in many respects that's really a new kind of understanding with respect to turbulence within the community. Okay, so the fact that a flow field is going to want to behave in sort of the same way, whether I have Newtonian or non-Newtonian viscosity, or whether I have different types of forcing or boundary conditions, is really a manifestation of kind of how robust turbulence is. And this is, probably what makes it so difficult to control. And so, a manifestation of a very simple way to describe robustness is to say, if I go into a system and I sort of give it a forcing that has maybe 2 equal directions, and I feed it through that system and it's robust, it tends to want to amplify only one thing. And sort of at the extreme, right, it just sort of ignores the 2 direction here and just gives us an output in the 1 direction. And so she's saying that's what turbulence is doing, is it's so robust, and the robustness is basically saying, I'm going to get rid of a lot of stuff. I don't care what the forcing is. I'm going to generate the same sort of structures. And so what she's done is she's gone through and said, well, is this true? And the answer is yes, it is for the most part true. Here we're taking a look at a particular analysis of one of those modes from the previous slide, and it shows that there are 2 modes that are going to be very dominant in what's going on, and everything else is going to be a full order of magnitude less important in the flow field. Well, okay, well that's an analysis, but is that really true? Well, if you compare it to what's happening for a DNS, so a full simulation of what's happening in turbulence, it turns out it is fairly true. So here's what we're going to call the turbulence kinetic energy would be, and so red things are high turbulence kinetic energy, and blue is low turbulence kinetic energy. This is what the resolvent analysis predicts. This is how it's distributed as a function of these 2 different wave numbers, and here's what the direct numerical simulation tells us. And the fact that the contours lie right on top of where the red is indicates that, number 1, turbulence is robust and has a low representation, and number 2, this resolvent analysis can capture that, which means instead of having to do a full direct numerical simulation with a very large supercomputer, we're getting insight into the dynamics with a lot less. Okay, so flow physics for control is not just about looking at canonical flows like turbulent wall turbulent boundary layers. It's really about understanding more complicated interactions. And so we have other types of interactions that we're looking at, and I'm going to present sort of two types of interactions today. The first one is an interaction between two different types of separations that can occur in a flow field. So we have a wake behind this bluff body, and then we also have a separation that occurs on the upper surface. And then we've made some recent investments in looking at acoustic interactions and how they're sort of playing in transition behavior and how you might actually be able to do some sort of separation control. So we'll start off with the work by Catafesta and his colleagues Rajat Mittal and Clancy Rowley at Princeton. And so what they've been doing over the course of the last 4 or 5 years is looking at how do different separated flows in a particular interaction sort of interact with each other. And so what they've done is they've used some techniques that were developed by, or adapted, I should say, by Clancy Rowley for fluid flows, looking at global dynamic modes. And so they take experimental data that Lou Catafesta has been acquiring at Florida State, and they do an analysis on it, and they're able to identify important modes that exist in these flow fields. And then they're able to not just identify sort of the spatial distribution, which you're seeing in the colored plots here. So flow is from left to right, and this is kind of the wake, which is this region over here, right? But they're also able to identify the important frequency content. And one of the things they realize is that there's an important coupling between, if I have a separation here, I have frequencies associated with that structure, and then frequencies associated with the wake. And those two things are coupling together and locking onto each other, and they have a way to capture this quantitatively. So that gives them insight on, all right, if I want to control this flow, what do I do? Well, there's a couple of things you can do. You can target the wake mode, which is you can target the wake frequency that's over here. And what that does is that gives you a certain behavior in the flow field. This is a simulation of the separated flow up here, and we're seeing a merging of two vortices right here. Conversely, if I target the shear layer mode, what I get is really just a roll-up that ends up reattaching this flow field. The bottom line is that by looking carefully at the dynamics of these two flows and how they interact, they're able to come up with strategies that are reducing the overall drag and managing this particular flow field. Okay, so one of the other things we're looking at here is how acoustic interactions can occur with a fluid flow. Now, so for a long time, the first 100 years of aerodynamics, we were primarily concerned with sort of higher, faster, farther kind of strategy, which really pushed airplanes to bigger and faster, higher Reynolds numbers, where the effects of viscosity were usually confined to fairly narrow regions close to the body, and for the most part, they were a problem. Don't get me wrong, but we developed many techniques for how to handle them reasonably well. At the other end, in the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of sort of bio-inspired concepts, much lower Reynolds numbers. But there's this whole region in between where we've sort of not paid too close of attention, or we've tried to sort of skip over, because you're in this region where the flow is transitional, which means it might be laminar, it might be turbulent, or there might be some really important interaction going on. And that's the region that Vladimir Golubev has been working in. It's this transitional region where you're getting basically a flow field coming that's laminar across the top of this airfoil or this wing. It develops some transitional behavior. There's a separation that occurs, and then it creates basically turbulence, which emits acoustic tones from the trailing edge, which feeds back upstream to what's happening in the flow field. And he has some experimental work going on with a collaborator in France, which is what this picture kind of shows. The red arrows are the direction of the fluid flow, and they have some surface flow viz, so the dark line indicates a separation line. And then his simulations show that the red and the blue there are the vortical structures, and then the lines are the acoustics. So you're seeing how the separation region is causing these acoustics to feed back up. Well, how do they know that's the case? Well, because if you go and do something really simple, like just trip the whole flow field so it's turbulent. So over here we have, without any turbulence, and you can see we've got this red and orange piece coming in here, so we have a high acoustic feedback. If we trip the flow and make it turbulent, that little spike over here goes away. All right, so it's clearly this feedback mechanism, and then they're looking at how does this behave, how do these modes and these interactions occur, whether you're on the top or the bottom surface of the airfoil. Usually separation occurs on the top surface, so you're seeing this interaction here. We're basically looking at the growth of instabilities in the boundary layer, and they grow when you're in the separation region, and as soon as if the flow reattaches and you get a little separation bubble, that growth stops. On the bottom, it's much more well behaved. So this gives us some insight into what's happening, what might cause sort of a transition in the boundary layer when we're at these sort of critical Reynolds number regimes. How we go about controlling that is something we might also be able to do with acoustics. And this is some work that Jeff Spedding's been doing, and he's basically just, this just sort of highlights what one of the problems is. So this is a typical plot of aerodynamic information, all right, for a wing. And it's the coefficient of lift, right, is a function of the coefficient of drag. This is called the drag polar, and there's lots of stuff you can do with this plot. But usually it has this nice sort of C shape to it. And we're plotting a bunch of data here from a Reynolds number of 10,000 to 60,000. And there's a, this stuff looks, the green and the blue looks okay. And then, well, what's happening here with the red and the dark blue? And what's happening there is we're getting this sort of transition. The flow is laminar, it separates, it transitions to turbulent, it reattaches, and we get a much different sort of lift, much better lift, you might argue, for the same drag. All right. How can we control this if we want to have wings that sort of fly at this particular case? Well, Jeff has been saying, well, if I really look at the reattachment, and what we're looking at here is just kind of a flow visualization shot of where the flow is separating. The things I want to pay attention to here are, so the bright line that kind of goes right through the middle here, that's just the surface of the wing. And then this line up here with the curly on it, that's the separated flow, and then what's below it is just a reflection. What Jeff's hypothesis is that if we watch what's happening to that separation point, that's going to tell us about what's going on. And he's trying to modify that by doing an acoustic forcing in the surface of the wing. Okay, so moving on now to unsteady aeromechanic interactions. Here we're still interested in flow physics, but now we're going to begin to recognize that there's going to be some dynamic motion going on in our airplane. It's not going to be perfectly rigid like the previous cases or like many cases that we look at. But there's going to be flexibility in the structure, and then a coupling between the fluid dynamics and that flexibility is going to be important in defining what's going on in the interaction. So we're going to take a look at a couple of cases here, sort of two themes really. The first theme is going to sort of look at the dynamics of things that are in motion. So it's beginning to sort of recognize that there's some motion going on here, and how is that going to change our aerodynamic interaction. And then the second theme here is going to be, well, all right, if we have some understanding for how that's changing, what can we do or what do we need to do in order to manage it and maybe try to control the separation that's going on. So we're going to start with sort of two complementary activities. The first one by Don Rockwell at Lehigh, and then he has a long-standing collaboration with Miguel Visbal, who's a star team lead at an AFRL RQ. And they're going to be looking at, if you start looking at a kinematically actuated wing and what is happening in that particular flow field. So I have a movie here. Don't start it yet, Carlotta. I want to sort of explain what we're looking at here so that you have some context. So what we have is basically two wings that are revolving around a common axis, but they're sort of located at different points from where that rotational axis is. So you can kind of see the picture down here at the bottom right-hand side of what's going on. So there's the axis, and then this wing is kind of rotating around that. So a revolving wing. And what we're visualizing here are something called Q contours. But basically, this is just, if you were to look at smoke visualization of these flow fields, you would see these blue contours. They're like, we're mapping out the vortices that are in the flow field, and the vortices and the strength of those vortices is very important in determining aerodynamic forces and moments that exist on these wings. So if we can understand the behavior of these vortices, then we can get a handle on what's happening in the flow field. So the thing that's varying here is what's called the Rossby number, which is basically the length of this axis that the wing is rotating around, and the Rossby number is a measure of inertia to sort of the fact that you've got a moving coordinate system, so the Coriolis effect that's going on in the flow field. So what we're going to look at is the wings aren't going to move. In fact, it's going to look like the structures aren't even moving, but the color scheme is going to change. All right, and we're going to see the little bar move along here. So we're looking at the weakest part of the structure here in this flow field, this turbulent of these vortices. And as the movie plays, we're going to be looking at stronger and stronger parts. So if a particular wing has a really dark region to it, that means there's a lot of coherence in those vortices, and there's a lot of strength in there, and that's going to be important in understanding how persistent these structures are and their effect on the circulation and the forces. Okay, so let's roll that movie. Okay, so what we see here is, right, so you can begin to see what's happening. On the left-hand side, with the Rossby number of 1, there's still a lot of sort of dark here, but over here it's pretty much disappeared and gone, which means in this part of the flow field, right, over here, there's a lot of coherence in this particular case. The movie will restart, and we can, maybe when the second time around, it will be obvious, okay? So you can see on the Rossby number of 5 how very quickly we lose, right, intensity of these vortices. They becomes islands, and then they're just pretty much disappearing. But in the Rossby number of 1, there's still a lot of coherence, which means that they're very strong vortices with this Rossby number of 1, stronger than they are at the higher one, and there's greater coherence, which means that this flow field is, number 1, going to be more stable. We're going to know more about what's happening with the aerodynamic forces and moments that are going on in this particular case, and that you're going to, if you were thinking about trying to design something that had a revolving type structure to it like this, you would want something maybe with a smaller Rossby number so that you have a more compact structure. So that's one aspect of looking at a revolving wing. Okay, so what Miguel Bisbal and Dan Garman have been doing at RQ is they've been saying, okay, well, we can also look at things like aspect ratio. So that is, we saw just one sort of short stubby wing in the previous slide, but now we're looking at sort of, I guess I've overdone it with the laser pointer there. So we saw an example of this case, aspect ratio 1, but now we're having basically a wing that has a longer span to it, 2 and then 4. And we're looking at the similar type of structure, but now it's just not animated. We're looking at the vortices that occur there. And the things that we notice about this is that there's a very important, so you can see the sense of rotation. The top piece here, this is what's called the leading edge vortex. It's connected to the wing tip, or the tip vortice and the root vortex. So you've seen tip vortices. These are the things that you see in crop duster pictures, right? So at aspect ratio 1, well, that's kind of well behaved. It doesn't look too crazy. Aspect ratio 2, we can see the structure's getting bigger as it moves farther out. By the time we get to 4, it's saturated, and so insofar as it's grown so big that it consumes the entire chord of the wing, and it's clearly beginning to undergo some sort of transition from a sort of laminar type configuration to something much more complicated in turbulence. Well, it turns out that that has an impact on the aerodynamic force coefficients, which you're seeing in the plot there. Once the structure saturates by filling the whole chord, you tend to sort of see a saturation in the lift. Whereas at the smaller aspect ratios, the stubbier wings, you have less of an issue with that. Okay. So those are cases where we're actuating something sort of purposefully and looking at the dynamics. What about flexibility? How can we begin to introduce flexibility into a flow field, but in a sort of controlled way that doesn't sort of introduce too many complicating features all at one time? And so what Charles Williamson at Cornell has done is he said, well, I've got this idea for a facility which he calls the Cyber Physical Fluid Dynamics Facility. I think it goes by a variety of names out in the community, including something called model following a sort of approach. But what he does is he has a water channel and he puts a structure in there. It could be a wing, could be a cylinder, could be whatever shape you want. And he cooks it up and he moves it through the water, and he senses the forces and moments on that, and then he feeds back through a simple second-order model what the dynamics would be. It says if I had these forces and moments, here's where the model would move to. And he sort of lets the model, he actuates and causes it to move in that particular direction. So he's not prescribing the kinematics, he's more like prescribing the compliance of the structure and then just letting the sort of interaction sort of define where the flow field's going to go. And this has, to me, this makes a lot of sense because when you think about birds, which motivate, say, flapping wing flight, for example, the bird's not just out there going, all right, I have to go from minus z to plus z to minus z to plus z. It says I have a certain force that I can exert, and then the motion that's prescribed by the wing is really defined by the aerodynamic interaction. And that's what Williamson's work is really capturing in a sort of a very controlled laboratory environment. So one of the things he's done with this is he said, all right, well, let's just start simple, try to understand what we can do here. Let's just take a vortex-induced vibration caused by a cylinder. Right, so this is, you normally see telephone wires or something like that bouncing up. I say telephone wire, there's an anachronism, isn't there? But a wire strung between two poles by the roadside, and when a wind blows across it, of course, you get an aerodynamic interaction there, and it'll vibrate up and down, and it'll be damped at some level. Okay, so that's kind of what we're looking at here, is we have our circular cylinder, we have a spring, and we have a damper. And the difference between sort of what's historically been done, which is to assume a linear spring constant, with this particular system, you can introduce nonlinearities into the spring constant. So how does this change what's happening in the system in general? Well, if you just go and do sort of the first thing that anybody would imagine doing, which is just, I'm just going to increase the speed of the fluid moving past my cylinder and see what happens, you get something that looks like this plot. And there's some lines in here, and you can see there's kind of a hump and then a plateau, and then it falls off. So we're varying the velocity. It's just written as a Reynolds number here. And we're measuring the amplitude of the vibration. All right, for all these different cases, and there's a linear case in here as well, this dark line. But nothing seems to collapse. All right, and so the reason for that is because for a linear system, if you have a linear spring constant, then there's only one frequency and amplitude combination. I get a particular flow path that I get a certain vibration or frequency, and it goes to an amplitude, and that's all it's going to do. But when you have a nonlinear spring, you sort of break up that relationship. There are multiple amplitudes and multiple frequencies that the cylinder can move up and down at, even with the fixed velocity. And so what Charles recognized is that we need to rescale this. We have to allow for the fact that the frequency and the amplitude are no longer connected. So he's changing the f down here from the constant that it is for linear to a function that is for nonlinear. And when he does that, it all collapses to the linear case, which is a really nice and tidy result. So there are two kind of important implications here. Number one, it means that if I'm at a particular frequency and a particular amplitude, even whether I have a linear or nonlinear spring, the actual fluid dynamics is going to be the same. So if you were to look at if you ignore the cylinder and just look at the fluids, it's all the same. The other thing that's really important here, that begins to have implications for how you can use this information, is that for a linear spring, and the plot on the right-hand side, there's only one point that you're going to be at for a given velocity. Right? If I choose a particular velocity, right, I can calculate my U star, and I go up and I say, aha, that's the amplitude. But for a nonlinear spring, because I've broken that relationship between the frequency and the amplitude, I can reside at a number of different points along this plot for the same sort of air stream blowing past. And when you think about that, you can begin to understand how you might be able to exploit that in a larger sort of aircraft system. Okay, so one way to sort of look at these more complex aeromechanic interactions is to do something with this sort of structural piece like Charles was doing. The other thing that we can look at is how sort of variations in the free stream might cause complex aeromechanic interactions. So here's some work that's being done by Dave Williams and Tim Colonius, and they're really looking at how, instead of treating sort of a gusting flow as a problem when you're flying. I mean, everybody's in an airplane, and you feel turbulence, you feel a gust, you always think, how is this, how can we mitigate this? Their take is, well, how can we potentially benefit from this? So what they have is a wing, and we're seeing both experiments and computations here. And just the sine wave up there is just how the free stream velocity varies. So they have a way of just sort of shuttering the wind tunnel or causing a free stream variation in the simulations. That just follows a sinusoidal pattern. And they look at different frequencies. And what they find is that depending upon the frequency of this variation in the flow field, you get different sort of fluid dynamics effects in the flow, and that impacts how that impacts the phasing basically between the aerodynamic loading on the wing and the timing of the gusts that you're getting in there. I'm sure that's not surprising to anybody, but what we're trying to do now is quantify exactly what's happening. And so that's what we're seeing in this particular picture here. There's actually a couple of things here. So different frequencies indicated by these different K values, as well as experiments tend to be run at much higher Reynolds numbers than simulations are. So, but yet we see good overall features, a good comparability in the overall features, and then they've captured and quantified sort of how the phase relationship changes as I change the frequency, which this gust kind of comes through. And this is going to be used then to feed into to modeling of the flow fields, because ultimately we want to do some sort of control of these of a wing when it's experiencing these gusts. So how do we go about doing control then, you might ask? Oh, I'm running out of time quickly here. So well, one of the ways you can do this is you can come in with some sort of fluidic actuation. So basically you're blowing through the surface of your wing, for example. And so what Ari Gleiser at Georgia Tech and Bob Moser at UT Austin are doing is looking at what is the sort of transient effect of me putting some sort of slight impulse into the flow field. So in the top picture here, they just have an airfoil, just a static wing. It's at an angle of attack where the flow would separate, and they say, let me just put in a very short pulse. And that pulse is 1/10 of what's called a convective cycle, which is to say I have a wing that's this long and I have air blowing over it, and it takes a certain amount of time for the flow to move past it. So they put in a pulse for 1/10 of a convective cycle, and they look at what happens to the flow field. And what you see on the top there is basically just a bunch of shots of the flow field, right, as we move, and 2 convective cycles after, so 20 times after the length of the pulse, we still see this effect. And then they're also looking at how this could then be used, not just in a static airfoil, but something that's actually pitching up and down between 2 angles of attack at a certain rate. And they're showing in here how they can manage the lift variation. All right, so the baseline would be if we didn't have any control. And with their control system here, they're able to show how they can change depending upon when in the cycle they input this pulse. Well, one of the things that we've learned in sort of 20 years of doing flow control is that, number one, we have to do some sort of closed loop control. So we have to sense what's happening in the flow field, and then we have to be able to make some sort of prediction about what it's going to do so we know how to do control. And so we have sort of 2 projects that I'll just touch briefly on. This is one that's led by Clancy Rowley, whose name you saw earlier, as well as Dave Williams, whose name you saw earlier. And they're basically looking at how to develop a linear model, right, that captures very complex sort of aeromechanic interactions, where we get a complicated variation in the forces that might exist on a wing. So here we're just doing what's called a double pitch up maneuver, pitch up to 10, pitch to 20, and here's what the lift looks like. Pretty messy. Well, Clancy's been able to develop a model, or several models, linear models, that he sort of has that work within particular regimes, and he's been able to capture fairly accurately what's happening in that. And the nice thing about his models is it doesn't just tell you what the lift's going to be, but it also will tell you what the flow field structure might be, depending on what you want to look at. So another effort that's going on that's looking at modeling is one that's run by Jeff Eldridge. This is sort of more of a first principles kind of approach, but so it's going to take into account the nonlinearity, but it's really based upon an inviscid approach. That is, we ignore viscosity. So it's not a closed model. There are pieces there that we're missing, but he fills that in by basically creating a framework for how to describe what's happening in the flow field, and then takes a particular case and lets that sort of fill in the details. And so we're just seeing here is just a couple of different levels of fidelity. So this would be a direct numerical simulation. This is sort of what's what's called a medium fidelity kind of simulation. And this one is pretty much first-year graduate student exercise kind of simulation. Put in a couple of very point vortices, and you can describe the behavior of separated flow behind a plate that's very nearly perpendicular to a flow field. So you get this alternating pattern of shed vortices. Okay, so finally, the novel flight mechanics, and so this area is, this is the science that exists at the interface between biology and aerodynamics. I used to have a stronger presence in the portfolio. It's been scaled back a little bit in the recent years, but I think it's very important to maintain some level of activity here, because as you can see from our mammal friend here flying in this video, that there's still a lot that can be done aerodynamically. That flying animals have a much greater agility and capability than we do with airplanes. And so one of the things we're doing is we have an investment with Robert Dudley. This has just started within the last year, and he's made great progress. But basically, Robert Dudley is a biologist, and his expertise is with hummingbirds. And he's looking at how a hummingbird manages to control its body in sort of a gusting environment. And so what he's done, which if I was a hummingbird, what I'd find very annoying, is he puts a feeder right downstream of a circular cylinder, which creates a nice ugly wake, and then he watches what happens to the bird and quantifies that. And it turns out that even though it's moving all over the place, it still manages to sort of keep its, as it were, beak on station in these particular cases and continue feeding. Very good. That's right. And then, so the other piece is we continue to support work by Sharon Swartz and Kenny Breuer at Brown on bats and aeromechanics of bats. And this is some work just looking at when you have bats flying together, sort of how do they interact in terms of where they position themselves. And we can see here simply that there's a bats exiting, I think this is the Austin cave, but it doesn't make a difference where it is. But you can see that there's one particular bat circled by the red, which kind of goes through a very complicated maneuver, and then kind of interacts with another one, and then exits out of the field of view. Sort of comes in. There's this interaction there, right, and then swats that one on the head with its wings, and it still manages to sort of fly and maneuver. I don't think we can do that yet in the Air Force. So, all right. So, and that's all I have for you today. Thank you.